Now, in human evolution, anatomical modernity, becoming biologically modern, and becoming culturally modern, seem to have emerged at different times in our history. So, what do I mean when I say culturally modern? I mean things like art, evidence for religious belief, and so forth. So, in this lecture, we're going to talk about developments of the Upper Paleolithic and into the Neolithic that show that our ancestors, who had already been biologically modern humans for many thousands of years, became more culturally like us in more recent developments. So here, for example, in this image, we see 17,000-year-old cave paintings in Lascaux, France. So to give you an overview on the time periods that we're going to be talking about, the Paleolithic is the long period during which we evolved as biologically modern humans, from 2.6 million years ago with the first production of Oldowan tools until 12,000 years before the Common Era, or about 14,000 years ago with the development of early agriculture. The Mesolithic is the transition between that first domestication of crops until truly agricultural villages, from about 14,000 years ago to about 12,000 years ago. And then the Neolithic is 12,000 years ago, or 10,000 years before the Common Era, till about 4,500 years before the Common Era. Now, to help you understand these terms, whenever we say lithic, we mean stone, right? So a lithic artifact is a stone artifact. So like a stone tool would be called a lithic. Paleo, Meso, and Neo just mean old, middle, and new. So when I say Paleolithic, what I mean is the Old Stone Age, Mesolithic, the sort of Middle Stone Age, and Neolithic, the New Stone Age. So the Paleolithic is such a long time period between the first production of an Oldowan chopper until modern humans starting to become farmers, that we really need to divide it up into different time periods. So in the last few lectures, when we've talked about the evolution of biologically modern humans, we've been in the lower and middle Paleolithic. What we're really talking about in this lecture is the upper Paleolithic, the last really 40 to 60,000 years of the Paleolithic period. So what do we mean when we say this? Well, society in the Upper Paleolithic, human society, was essentially one of small family-based hunter-gatherer groups that we sometimes call bands. These people were not living in permanent villages. Rather, they were moving across the landscape, probably seasonally, using campsites to take advantage of resources that were available to them. They were egalitarian, which doesn't mean people are equal all the time, but it means everyone has sort of the same opportunities to rise to preeminence in their society. They had relatively little economic specialization, meaning everybody did more or less the same jobs, with the exception that age and gender can be important sort of subdividing factors in these societies. And they use small-scale technologies. This makes sense because they're mobile. They're moving around the landscape, so if you were doing that, you'd only want what you could carry with you in a backpack, probably, and not really large-scale tools. So in terms of the chronology that we're talking about here, really it's about the last 40,000 years that we consider the Upper Paleolithic, sort of 40 to 14,000 years ago, that we consider the Upper Paleolithic, when all of these cultural changes really happened quickly, and we're going to talk about what those changes were. So you can see here these different artistic traditions known for Europe. You can see some different tool technologies identified in Asia and Africa, and then also in Indonesia and Australia, some examples of really early cave art that we're going to talk about at Sulawesi Caves. So even as far back as 100,000 years ago, really before the Upper Paleolithic transition that I'm talking about, there is early evidence of emerging modern human thought. Here, for example, we see an artifact from Blombos in South Africa that's estimated to be 100,000 years old. And at Blombos Caves, there's evidence of producing beads maybe making some tally marks on carved stone, and even possibly using ochre as a kind of paint, maybe for body paint, maybe for painting, on cave walls or something like that. These examples are kind of few and far between, but I always think we need to stay tuned because we could keep finding earlier examples of kind of the first emergence of symbolic modern human thought. But for the purposes of this class, there really does seem to be kind of an explosion of behavioral modernity after about 40,000 years ago, and that's really what we're going to emphasize in this lecture. So features of the Upper Paleolithic and into the Neolithic, or the Upper Early Stone Age and into the New Stone Age, that distinguish this emerging modern human thought from Middle Paleolithic thought before about 40,000 years ago. I'm going to name 9 key features, and just keep an eye on the slides for the text in yellow. That'll be what I'm emphasizing for that particular slide. So the first feature we want to talk about is new and improved stone technologies. Now, just as we mentioned with the emergence of the first modern humans, humans seem to have a real emphasis on blade technology. So something that happened starting about 40,000 years ago is an even greater emphasis on making more efficient blade tools. The next feature that we are going to talk about is new technologies for hunting. And remember what time period this is. This is the sort of emerging height of the last ice age. So some of those technologies for hunting would have initially been tools for taking down large-bodied animals. So here, for example, we can see a stone projectile point deeply embedded in the skull cap of an extinct giant bison, Bison occidentalis. This is from the Americas. So why were humans in the Upper Paleolithic developing technologies to hunt these large animals? Well, it was in many ways because of expanding glacial landscapes. As more and more water was trapped in the polar ice caps as the last ice age sort of came to its greatest peak, sea levels would have decreased, and even in areas without ice, there would have been expanding grasslands. So here, for example, in this reconstruction of North America, we can see Florida would have been a much larger landmass, so the coastlines would have been different, and much of North America and essentially all of Canada is trapped under these huge ice sheets, which in some cases could have been a mile thick. Now, this didn't just affect the environment where the ice actually was, but in places adjacent to the ice, such as much of the continental United States, there would have been huge grasslands. Those huge grasslands would have worked much the way savannas work in Africa today, which is that they support large-bodied animals. So we call these megafauna, huge animals, such as you can see here, this extinct giant camel relative, this extinct woolly rhinoceros, a giant sloth, and then some of the big scary predators that would have survived by hunting these large animals. At this time, between about 40 and 15,000 years ago, the North America would have been a really different place. If you've ever been to the La Brea Tar Pits Museum, you can see some direct evidence of this with fossils that they found from extinct species of large-bodied animals that would have survived on the great savannas of North America and parts of Europe that weren't covered by ice. So in order to survive in these environments, humans alive at that time developed technologies to help them hunt these large animals. These included things like spear tips, they included things like hunting drives and so forth, so that they could drive these large animals into bogs or drive them off cliffs. Now, as the last ice age sort of began to warm up again, and as the world was changing, and some of these large-bodied animals began to go extinct, there was a broadening of the diet. So as we move to the very end of the Paleolithic and into the Neolithic, human diets broadened out into including not just megafauna, but also things like smaller terrestrial mammals, sea mammals, coastal resources, more plants, birds, and so forth. And we can see evidence for this at archaeological sites. So here we have a subsistence change from the Paleolithic to the Mesolithic, where you see in the lower Paleolithic an emphasis on large and medium-sized animals and on nuts and roots. And then as we move toward the upper Paleolithic and Mesolithic, in part because of the changing landscape, humans, in order to survive, had to rely more and more on smaller, more rapidly reproducing plants and animals, things like frogs and fish and rodents and lizards and birds, but also things like grasses. And this is going to become important for the emergence of agriculture. So I like to show this slide because it's a little bit funny, and you can see how close those ancient hunters standing in their boat are to those waterfowl. But one of the things that was happening during this transition out of the Paleolithic and into the Mesolithic is because water levels were rising, ocean levels were rising, wetlands were expanding, estuaries were expanding along coastlines and so forth. And as part of that change, there was a shift toward more and more water birds that people could get access to, toward more coastal resources as well. So hunting of waterfowl would have been important to Mesolithic peoples. Another feature of the transition out of the Paleolithic and into the Mesolithic and Neolithic would be better evidence for use of raw materials. Now, as I pointed out, it's likely that our last common ancestor with the modern great apes 6 to 8 million years ago would have used some tools made out of things like sticks. But in the archaeological record, these are hard to find evidence of. We usually find stone tools from such ancient time periods. And we have more evidence as we move out of the Paleolithic and into the Neolithic for humans using more kinds of raw materials. So these include not just stone tools, but also bone tools, antler tools, ivory and shell. So for instance, in order to take advantage of these expanding estuarine environments as the sea levels rise, humans would use more things like bone fish hooks, or complex technologies such as bone harpoons that actually would have been hafted probably into some kind of wooden handle so that they could be jabbed into an animal that was being hunted, and then actually removed and used again with a new tip attached. So we have more and more complex kind of small-scale hunting technologies. There's also evidence for more use of plant materials, and this is important again for exploiting smaller animal resources. So for example, there's more evidence of the production of fiber nets for things like animal traps. Here you can see at a reconstruction of an archaic North American camp, not only are these people using more medium and small-bodied creatures, such as this turtle that you can see in the foreground there. You can also see probably a domesticated dog. We've had dogs domesticated for about 40,000 years, so that's probably accurate. But also in the background, you can see two fisher people basically pulling that net across the lake in order to capture small fish. So the next feature of Upper Paleolithic society and Mesolithic and Neolithic as well is the obtaining of raw materials for tool making from greater and greater distances, bringing in things like obsidian, volcanic glass for making tools, bringing in things like shell from distant coastal areas, from sometimes hundreds of kilometers away. This suggests sure, these people may have been traveling, but humans have been traveling since back to Homo erectus. So what it may suggest is human groups having more and more contact and trade and interaction with one another, sort of more complex cultural practices. One of the things that we can see in this technological transformation as well is the development of more microliths, which means small, very, very tiny stone tools. These would have been, in some cases, hafted into like a wooden handle or a bone handle to make a cutting implement, or turned into a small drill tip. So it suggests more crafting practices. projectile points, particularly in the Mesolithic and Neolithic, became smaller as humans were exploiting more diverse and, in many cases, smaller animals as the megafauna were going extinct. The next feature that we'll talk about is larger sites of aggregation. Now, this relates to the transport of raw materials through trade because there's evidence to suggest that people were settling into maybe not permanent, but more like seasonal, larger occupation sites. So here we have an example of a Mesolithic campsite at Starcar. This is a famous site in England, where there's a larger community starting to gather on a seasonal basis according to what resources are available than would have been true earlier in the Paleolithic. Here in this painting we can see a reconstruction of a European Mesolithic band, and if you look carefully, there's a lot going on here in terms of not only social interaction with this group, but also technology. You can see people wearing jewelry. You can see people wearing clothing that probably had to be sewn together. In fact, that woman over on the right appears to be sewing a garment. The man, more or less in the center, who's kneeling down, appears to me to be making blades out of stone tools. Now, it may not be accurate. You wouldn't necessarily... I actually do a little bit of flint knapping as a hobby. You wouldn't want to do that right next to all your kids and family because it leaves a lot of sharp chunks, sharp debitage. It can actually be kind of dangerous. But the purpose of this painting is to kind of show you all the different practices that might be going on. So you can see someone in the background tanning a hide from an animal. Further in the background, you can see the different tents that they're using. You can see a giant extinct red elk over on the left that's being processed for meat and so forth. So it's unrealistic that all of these practices would have been happening right next to each other like this, but the idea is these are larger and larger kind of semi-permanent campsites where people are coming together to do their sort of seasonal social activities. Now there's another sort of recently discovered and really famous archaeological site called Göbekli Tepe in Turkey. We'll actually talk about this a little bit more later in class, but as far back as about 12,000 years ago, there's evidence at Göbekli Tepe that non-sedentary, seasonally nomadic hunter-gatherer peoples were actually gathering, perhaps annually during a special season of the year, to build a religious site with monolithic stone carvings and seating areas where different group members of society could gather and observe the religious rites. Related to those religious rites, another practice that we see emerging in the Upper Paleolithic and into the Neolithic and Mesolithic is more elaborate human burials. Now, Neanderthals apparently did practice some burials of their family members and loved ones back into the Middle Paleolithic, but humans, modern Homo sapiens sapiens, seem to have really kind of accentuated the production of more elaborate burials. So here at this Upper Paleolithic burial that's about 24,000 years old, we can see, this is in Italy, we can see an example of I believe a young woman who's been buried with a cap of snail shells. If you look closely, you can also see a necklace that she was wearing and some worked, probably bone tools. So there's lots of evidence of burials that had really elaborate kind of offerings left with them, which suggests symbolic thought, perhaps even an idea of religion or an afterlife. And again, related to that symbolic thought, and this is one of the most fun examples to share with you today, is more expression of symbolic thought through art. In some cases with really amazing cave paintings and sculptures that has suggested to archaeologists the development of intellectual and maybe even kind of spiritual or religious similarities with the way human groups think today. So some examples of Upper Paleolithic art include finds in Europe such as this Venus figurine in the lower right and different worked bone tools. You can see a bone with probably some extinct Pleistocene horses carved into it. You can see elaborate stone, or elaborate bone rather, tools such as that harpoon over there on the left. And this is a good example of where it's really fun to stay tuned and keep watching archaeology because new discoveries are being made all the time. just in the last few years, there have been some really important discoveries at Sulawesi in Indonesia, where cave art from up to 40,000 years ago has been discovered, and there's a link to an article about it in your weekly module for this week. But basically, archaeologists are using new imaging technology to reconstruct some kind of poorly preserved but very ancient cave art depicting animals on the walls of these caves in Indonesia. This is important in part because for a long time archaeologists thought that the first cave art was from Europe, but in fact there are more and more ancient examples discovered in parts of Asia. But there are some really incredible examples in Europe as well. Here we have at Chauvet Cave from about 30,000 years ago. Some really incredible artists in these caves were actually depicting animals by using the shape of the cave wall itself to give the animal some sort of three-dimensional depth, or in some cases, as you can see kind of in the upper center, almost the way modern cartoonists show motion of a living animal through multiple kind of still frame images of that animal. There's a lot of debate over what these things meant. Were they religious? Was it some kind of hunting magic? Is it kind of something approaching scientific curiosity? But in many cases, these are extinct Pleistocene animals being depicted in ancient caves that would have been difficult to access by people up to 30, 40,000 years ago in different parts of the ancient world. So here you can see on this slide some examples from Europe, Asia, Africa, and Australia of ancient sites of famous art. So you can see, for instance, there the Sulawesi Cave in Indonesia. You can see some of these famous European sites in places like Spain and France. And this development of human symbolic thought is something that's going to become is going to remain part of human history, and we'll see the development of lithic technologies and all of these trends toward living in larger settlements and more symbolic thought and a reliance on rapidly reproducing smaller species, not only of animals but also of things like grasses. All of that is going to be important as we move into the Neolithic and the origins of agriculture and sedentary society.